Welcome back to the channel. In today's video I'm going to be talking about how I use shutter speed for wildlife photography and just really my thought process behind when I choose to use a high shutter speed or a low shutter speed, and in what circumstances may I choose a high over a low and vice versa, and how you can use it to be a little bit more creative with your wildlife photography. But before I do that, if you're new here, my name is Ben Fitzcoster. I'm a wildlife photographer and I've got a master's in wildlife documentary production. I've done a little bit of photography, mostly self-taught, and I've also made a few wildlife documentaries of my own. And I just wanted to share my experience of how I use all of the different camera settings, so shutter speed, aperture and ISO, with regard to wildlife photography. Today I'm going to be talking about shutter speed. With that being said, let's get straight on to why and how I use shutter speed. So shutter speed controls how long your camera's sensor is exposed to light. It is also responsible for showing motion within your photographs. So a lot of us as wildlife photographers, especially in the UK anyway, love to take photographs of birds. There are a lot of different species of birds out there, especially very small birds that have extremely fast movements. So especially when they're flying, they are too fast really for the eye to see any detail or anything like that in the wing movements. So for example, if you wanted to get an image of a bird in flight and have it a nice sharp image where you can see all the detail of the wings and there is no blur or any kind of blur motion in the photograph whatsoever, this is when you are going to be using a high shutter speed. So for example, if you're photographing a bird in flight, you may want to consider definitely consider going up above 1/1000th of a second in your shutter speed. The higher the better. Depending on what you're photographing, it's going to make a massive difference. So if you're photographing a bigger bird, such as a heron in flight, you're not going to need as much of a high shutter speed. You could probably get away with around about 1/1000th. If, however, you are shooting or photographing a blue tit in flight, you will probably want to push that up as far as you can go. So my camera on the 70 Mark II goes up to 1/8000th. That may be a little bit too much. You don't really need to go that high. Say 1/3200, something like that, in order to capture that motion. The other thing to consider when you are using a high shutter speed or photographing fast moving subjects is the position of your subject. So for example, if a bird was flying horizontally across, so through this frame right now, I would want to be using a higher shutter speed than if the bird was flying directly towards me. This is because movements are a lot faster when they're flying horizontally along than they are flying directly towards. So you would need a much faster shutter speed if that was the circumstances. Likewise, if you're using a telephoto lens or you are very close to your subject, then the smallest movements have, so micro adjustments are noticed significantly when you're either close to a subject or you're using a telephoto lens. So for that reason, you need to use a higher shutter speed as well, just to account for that increase in movement. So when might you want to use a slow shutter speed? If you're using a slow shutter speed, you are allowing essentially the shutter to stay open for longer, allowing more light to hit the sensor. This in turn also picks up motion. So for example, if a bird was in your frame, if you had a bird perched on a branch, for example, and it was feeding or eating from the bird feeder, and you had your camera and you were handheld and you were on, say, 1/25th of a second or even 1 second, you had just had it open for an entire second, the bird will obviously be moving quite a lot within that time. So if you do that, you're going to get a lot of blur in your image, and it's through motion blur. So you would tend to pick up a lot of blur from the actual subject. So this technique of using a slower shutter speed is often used with low light photography, night photography, things like that. So if you've ever seen those pictures on highways where you've got vehicle lights, just trail light of the light going through the frame, that has been done through using a slow shutter speed. I also did this myself. I had a little go with it up in Manchester, and I got this photograph of the tram with the tram lights, and actually it's quite effective. Obviously the problem with this is that when you are hand holding the camera, you just cannot physically hold it still enough to basically stop motion blur from your own physical handshake. Which is why when you're using a slower shutter speed, it's usually recommended that you put your camera onto a tripod. I know that a lot of people who use the Micro Four Thirds system, such as Panasonic and Olympus, will be able to still shoot really low shutter speeds handheld and still get sharp images, which is incredible, and it's a great advantage of using Micro Four Thirds system. The Canon 7D Mark II is a APS-C cropped sensor camera, so and it doesn't have inbuilt body stabilization, and so really for me to use that with just my hand holding it for low light photography or even low shutter speed, it's just not going to happen. I'm not going to get any decent images. So it starts getting a little bit more complicated when you start using slower shutter speeds, because you need to use a tripod. You need to know how long the shutter needs to be open in order for you to get that motion blur, the right motion blur, whilst keeping the subject in focus and not making the subject blurry, because that's not really what we're trying to go for. When would we use slow shutter speed with wildlife photography? I mean, there are lots of different types of times when you would want to use it. You can use it for being creative, and for examples I can't even think of right now. But say, for example, you wanted to implement some kind of motion within your photography, instead of having just everything sharp and everything still, by using a high shutter speed. So, for example, heron in flight, you might start by practicing with your higher shutter speeds, and you've got it in focus. You've got the bird in focus, you've learned how to track the bird, you understand its flight path. Once you've got to that point, you can start bringing down your shutter speed. So bring it down from 1/1000th, bring it down to 1/800th. Still getting it sharp, that's great. Bring it down again. And by doing this, we can try to achieve a photograph where we are getting the background blurry, so we are creating motion in our photograph. So the heron will stay sharp, and then the background behind the heron will blur out. So it's hard to explain, but I'll try and put a picture up to sort of show you what I'm trying to explain to you right now. So yeah, I definitely recommend by starting with a higher shutter speed. And once you've got a little bit more familiar with your shutter speed, then try and bring it down and get a little bit more creative with your shutter speed, and try some slow shutter speed photography. Another example of slow shutter speed for wildlife photography would be, for example, a bird like a swan that is on a lake and has got wet feathers. A lot of the time you'll see that they'll just shake their feathers and all the water will spray off, whilst their head is still. So if you're focusing on the head of the swan's head will stay sharp, whilst the body of the swan that's moving will sort of blur out, and you'll see that motion of the shaking of the body. You'll also get the motion of the water droplets which are flying off the swan. So instead of just a sharp water droplet, you'll get a thin strip of water going through the frame, and it just makes it a little bit more different, which makes it a little bit more unique and a little bit more creative. So same with rain. If you're photographing rain, you can mix it up, try some high shutter speeds, try some low shutter speeds, and then you get that really nice trail of rain just coming through the frame, and yeah, it's pretty awesome. So yeah, it is actually really fun playing around with your shutter speed. I'd say the easiest way to get to grips with it is to put your camera in shutter priority, and start by using a high shutter speed and trying to get fast moving subjects in frame, in shot, and sharp. Once you've done that, you can then progress on to using a slower shutter speed and using a tripod to help you out with those slower shutter speeds as well. So that's my quick summary. I don't know if it was quick actually, but that's my summary of shutter speed and how I use shutter speed with wildlife photography. I hope that this has helped in some way. If it has, let me know. Drop a comment in the comments box down below. And aside from that, I'll be talking about aperture in my next video. So if you want to see that, subscribe to the channel, and thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.